So welcome everyone to this joint event organized by London Business School Wheeler Institute for Business and Development and Università Bocconi's Innocenzo Gasparini Institute for Economic Research. This webinar will focus on Africa and will try to take an optimistic view on the continent. This is going to be Africa's turn. We are very pleased as London Business School and Bocconi to co-organize this event, and we're truly thrilled to have a great panel. Actually, we couldn't dream of a better panel. So let me briefly introduce the panelists. We will host today Leonard Wantchekon. For economist and political scientist, Leonard doesn't need much of an introduction. He is a professor of politics and economics at Princeton University. Before that, he taught at Yale. He taught at NYU. And most importantly, Leonard is doing very innovative research on African political economy, on economic history. And this reflects also his youth, where he was one of the leaders for democracy and civil and political rights in his home country, Benin. And perhaps most importantly, given our discussion today, Leonard is an innovator as well. He has founded the African School of Economics in his home country, Benin. And we're all thrilled to see this initiative unfolding. Our second panelist will be Nick Hughes. Nick comes from the business side. He has been the founder of M-Pesa, one of the leading companies in the world on mobile telephony and e-banking and mobile more generally. And more recently, Nick has moved into the energy sector, being the CEO and founder of M-Copa. The event will be moderated by our great colleague, Eliana La Ferrara. Eliana has done very important work in political economy, in development in Africa and elsewhere. She graduated from Harvard, and over the past decade, not only she has written some amazing papers in this area, but she has also done considerable service. She has been president of the European Economic Association. He has also served as a leader of BRED, the Bureau for Research in Economic Development. So you don't need me to discuss more that. Let me just say that on behalf of LBS, we're very thrilled that together with Nicola, Gennaioli from EGR and Bocconi side, we're co-organizing this event. Eliana, the floor is to you. Nick and Leonard, thanks again for being with us today.
Thank you, Elias. And I really want to thank Elias and Nicola because when they asked me to moderate this panel, I thought it was such a privilege. I really admire Leonard and Nick for what they've done. And I do think that this conversation is going to shed light on the potential that Africa has. And maybe I can say a little bit of how the idea for the topic came about. It was actually after a discussion where Nicola and I heard someone saying en passant that Africa was not going to grow for the next 10 years. And this seemed a little off. And I think what we want to do today is understand if that's the case or not, and look at the various facets of common thinking about Africa. So I would actually start precisely from this growth stimulus and ask Leonard to tell us a bit about what he thinks in terms of Africa's growth prospect. Is it true that it won't grow at rates that are comparable, for example, to Southeast Asia, or and also what has happened to Africa in the past decade from a macro perspective? Can you quickly, bring us to speed on this, on your thinking?
Thanks for the opportunity. I think your initial comment was spot on. This assessment does not reflect the data and the different reports that we have seen. So, in fact, for the past 20 years, Africa have grown around 4%, and in fact, more than half of the top 10 best performing countries are from Africa, like Kenya. Best performing around the world are from Africa, like Ethiopia, Kenya, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire. That grown by more than 7%. So, and this growth rate has been driven in part by services, but also by extraction, by mining. And several analysts from the World Bank and other places have attributed this to better macro management, to peace and stability, improvement in investment climate, and also increase in digital communication. So clearly there are fundamental reasons as to why Africa has done so well. And obviously, poverty reduction has not followed as much because of these growth rates is coupled with increase in population, and but also drag in job creation, particularly, which is now. So it's very clear that Africa is on the right path. So it's confirmed by even other more sociological type work. Late Alberto Alessina and co-authors have shown, for instance, that the current generation in Africa is by and large better off than the past, than their parents. And in my own work, I find that Africans today are better off than their parents, who are better off than grandparents. So it shows that there is strong sense of social mobility and an optimism when it comes to Africa. So going forward, clearly there are some concern, like there is contraction by 3% in 2020 due to COVID. But according to the projection by the World Bank and African Development Bank, in 21 and 22, it will move to 2% and 3.3%. So if anything, the projections are positive. So my sense is that there is clear reason for optimism, and we don't have to compare, directly Africa to Asia. It's like if, I remember a letter of recommendation I wrote 15 years ago, where somebody said, "This is a great student, but he's not going to be as good as blank." So we don't have to be as good at Asia to be optimistic about the future of Africa.
Thank you, Leonard. And in fact, I think the work you refer to of Alessina and co-authors includes Elias. So, Elias is really another important contributor to this debate. I want to pick up on one of the aspects you mentioned related to digital technology and improvements in infrastructure, and ask Nick, from your perspective, what have you seen happening on that front, infrastructure, and especially, can you tell us a bit about the most innovative approaches that have been taken to overcome constraints? Because clearly infrastructure constraints are there. I think, your experience with M-Pesa and now in COPA is something that would be very interesting for our audience to hear about.
Yeah, great. Well, very happy to talk about that. And well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to join this panel. I always enjoy talking about some of the opportunities that lie ahead in Africa. And look, I'm very much an optimist. I think one of the challenges is when we look at Africa as a whole, it isn't really one place. There's huge variation. Of course, landscape, infrastructure, culture, politics, regulations. These all make for quite a fragmented continent. But at a whole, I'm right behind those people that believe that it's a continent that's changing fast, and there are many opportunities there. And I'll talk a little bit about M-Pesa, and I'll introduce M-Copa as well, because for me, those are two really good case studies of what we can do when we look at a gap in infrastructure, but don't see it as a problem, see it as an opportunity. And I think that's what's in front of us here. It's all about the lens that you look at problems through. I'm convinced that this is going to be there's going to be a great decade of growth ahead of us. In fact, I saw some statistics recently that said by 2050, 1 in 4 people in the world will be African. And so, if we're not thinking about that market as a business practitioner, then I think you're missing something, because those growth rates, and as Leonard was saying, 5 of the 10 fastest growing GDPs across the globe are in Africa. So I think there's 2 ways of looking at it. Yes, there are constraints, but there are also big opportunities, and there are many growth opportunities. What I'd like to do is just share a couple of slides, if I can, to talk specifically about M-Pesa, which, as many people will know, is a digital money platform. So M-Pesa today M-Pesa is Swahili for money, of course, and M is for mobile. But it's a huge success. But if it's 14 years old, and in some ways it's a little bit like a teenager. It's big, and it's moving around a lot, and it's making a difference certainly in East Africa, and we're starting to see similar schemes all around the globe, actually. But it started with a very simple proposition 14 years ago. We were trying to solve the problem of how you can move money between A and B. And 14, 15 years ago, the banks had only reached potentially something like 15% of the population. And so we were looking at what we could do using the technology to bridge that gap. And I'm going to summarize what is about 6 or 7 years of hard work to discover where the business model lay. But we eventually realized that we have this fantastic infrastructure to use, which is the mobile network. Most people have got handsets now, and increasingly those handsets are smart handsets. And then M-Pesa grew out of testing a very simple person-to-person payment platform. But today it drives over 1/3 of Safaricom's revenue, which is a pretty astonishing statement when you think this is a network operator, a telco, now taking most of its revenue from an adjacent sector, which is financial services. And within Kenya alone, there are 30 million active accounts. And all of that came because we looked at the problem, we looked at the gap, which was financial exclusion, and thought, how can we solve that using technology? There's been some work done by MIT that's worth looking at if people want to go and have a look at the social impact of M-Pesa in the country. It's lifted people out of poverty, and there's some great statistics to sort of back that up. So thinking about what does this mean more broadly and across other parts of Africa and in other sectors, this is where I'm an optimist. We now have an infrastructure network in the GSM network that covers 93% of the population. We have smartphones, as I was saying, now at about $30 or $40 each, affordable smartphones, and that network that they're running on is good quality. And for me, that allows us to create this top layer here on the slide and start to innovate around those 2 levers of connectivity and payments. And M-Kopa is an example for that. So we founded M-Kopa about 8 years ago. And on the face of it, it looks like an energy company. And so how are we joining up financial services and energy here? Well, changing tack slightly, there are 600 million people in Africa that don't have access to reliable grid power, and yet they've got a phone in their hand, and increasingly they can do a financial transaction off their phone. So thinking again about the way we can innovate the business model, we said, let's take a fully distributed solar unit, which you can see on the screen there. That's a solar panel, the costs of which have come down greatly in the last 5 years. It's a battery, a lithium-ion battery, LED lights, low power TVs, and you can just create a connected, fully distributed power system. And then inside that box is a GSM unit and a modem that allows us to remotely control that product. And so then a customer can say, okay, instead of paying 50 cents a day on kerosene or paraffin or running a diesel generator, if I pay you and M-Kopa 50 cents a day, can I have access to power? And they take this unit home, they install it in the home, and they just pay us as they use it. And that's a really simple, eloquent business model. And that starts to tackle straight away the gap that we see in the power infrastructure. But it doesn't actually just stop there. We've now got 1 million customers on M-Kopa. Well, we're selling TVs, we do fridges. We've recently taken the same model into smartphones. But if we take another step back and say, well, what have we created? We've actually created a financial service for those customers. As well as solving an energy problem, we've provided them with some collateral that they can demonstrate to us that they paid for over time. That allows us to then start profiling those customers who would previously be invisible really to the banks or the traditional financial institutions. but we're seeing a record of them making payments regularly against an asset. And that allows us then to think about refinancing that asset. So you can say, okay, we'll now reset the credit level on your power unit, and we'll give you a loan for your farm or a loan to pay your school fees. And then you're into a payment relationship with the consumer. And so for me, this is the way to approach these opportunities. It's to think differently about the infrastructure constraints and use technology, and especially digital technology, to find new ways to deliver very, very basic, simple, very clear and transparent services to consumers. And when we look ahead, I can see many more opportunities to do this. And yeah, and perhaps a little bit later in the conversation, we can look at some of the other opportunities that we can see out there that use this digital infrastructure that we've now got to play with in these markets.
Absolutely. And in terms of take-up, your experience so far has been positive also with M-KOPA, because there's a lot of technologies that development economists have thought would be immediately adopted and haven't been. So M-PESA has clearly been a success. How about this clean energy service? Do you have reason to think that adoption is going to be high, or is being high?
Yeah, well, I think the latest stats actually show about 570 million people that don't have access to reliable grid power. That's market failure, isn't it? Whatever way you look at that, that should not be the case. We should have figured out how we can bring affordable, clean power to people with much better success rates and uptake rates. But what I think what we're showing can work is where you change the business model and you think much more about a distributed model. You don't need necessarily to put large high voltage distribution systems across Africa. I mean, it just doesn't make sense given the geographical challenges, the affordability for consumers, and the fact that we can now, because of technology, we can create a fully distributed model. So I think that's back to the opportunity. There's a way to redesign those power systems. So we start to think about much lighter touch, cleaner infrastructure on a more of a distributed basis model. Now maybe M-KOPA is not the only one doing this. Of course, there are probably 20 companies doing the same thing now. But I do think we've seen a change in the last 10 years where we're moving away from those old models, sort of top-down infrastructure plays, and it's not dissimilar from what happened with M-PESA and in the banking world. Let's just stay focused on what consumers actually want and can afford to use, and build models that are much more related to these types of environments.
Thank you, Nick. So I want to shift a little bit from. I'm kind of using a production function in my head and thinking about the various inputs, and I want to shift from infrastructure to human capital and talk about education, the education sector in Africa and the quality of the labor force. Now here, Leonard is really a reference worldwide, because not only he has studied education and intergenerational mobility as it relates to education, but he has actually set up a very high level graduate program. And what I want to ask you, Leonard, is again a bit of your outlook on the state of the education sector in Africa, and also what we can do to improve that. You have a lot of initiatives that you've pioneered, so can we hear a bit about that?
Absolutely. So as you mentioned earlier, quality of learning coupled with high population growth has been a limitation for human capital development in Africa. And despite the spectacular improvement in access, there are many countries, particularly fragile countries, in Sahel, for instance, where access become a challenge with a strong gender gap. And more and more, we need to think about education reform as a system reform, that combines some kind of, that take the form of some kind of social contract between the key actors, parents, teachers, communities, governments, so that we can push for a very strong education reform across Africa. Now, one point that I would like to stress very forcefully is the role of higher education. You know, I think there had been emphasis on primary education, but higher education is extremely important, not only to build a skilled workforce, but also to be able to get us to think creatively about how to fix the development challenges in Africa. You know, I mean, this knowledge can not always be exported or imported. I mean, it has to be generated, you know, domestically. So that's the reason why, you know, I've set up, as you mentioned earlier, the African Council of Economics, which is a research university with the goal of not only train top level like policy makers, but also train academics, you know, to improve the representation of Africans at the top level in economics and also in finance and management. And, you know, for the past 20 years, we have been able to, for instance, place about 20% of our students in top PhD program and other 30% at the World Bank, WTO, and many other places, you know. So, and we use an approach which is very foundational, you know, like math, stats, economic history, and then giving the opportunity for students also to be very mobile. You know, recently we set up a program in Harlem, you know, which is joined with Hunter College that will provide an opportunities for Africans to study as well, you know, in New York, and also to reach out to African diaspora in general. So, for instance, this is an example of an ambitious project that not only want to improve education outcome, but also to train Africa on the highest level. Another important point is also, you know, research, you know, technological development. I remember that I read a piece by Abdul Salam, you know, the former Nobel Prize winner who set up the Institute for Theoretical Physics in Trieste, state that every African government has to spend up to 3 to 4% of GDP or of the budget on research, fundamental research, you know. And I think this is still very much, you know, important, you know, recommendation that we need to follow. In line with what Nick have said, it's important that university in Africa, scientists in Africa is very much part of this technological revolution that is needed, you know, to improve development access in Africa in general. Yeah,
I totally agree. And in fact, there's a lot of debate on how leadership and the intellectual elite lacks diversity. And it seems to me that this is one direction in which, especially if what we're trying to tackle are problems that many of us don't know firsthand, or at least not like someone who's grown in a country, that's the place to start. Now, there is a sense in which, you know, you said everybody focuses on primary or secondary education. I think one of the reasons for that, of course, aside from the importance of basic education, is also that there is a notion that the labor force that most of the agriculture or manufacturing sector has been needing so far wouldn't necessarily be as skilled as to require much more. But now with the type of growth opportunities that we've seen and that Nick mentioned earlier, you know, clearly there's much more to be done. So Nick, I wanted to ask you, in your experience, if the labor force that's out there in Africa is, in your view, is at the level of training and skills that's required in fast-growing sectors, and if not, what skills are missing or are underutilized? How do business people see the quality of the labor force in Africa?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and you know, I know East Africa particularly well, but if I was to go back 15 years, it was a real problem. there was a shortage of experienced and software engineers and developers and technical skills. But I would say that's changed now. In fact, almost the opposite. I think you've got a young generation of very eager, entrepreneurial people, and we see this a lot in East Africa coming through, who are starting to sort of operate up there amongst the best in the world. And I don't think it's a challenge anymore. The great thing about technology, of course, is you can run distributed teams. The early days of M-Pesa, we were using software engineers based in Germany and Cambridge in the UK, and we had to sort of do all of that technology work in those hubs. But that doesn't need to be the case now. If we look at the team that's in M-Copa, and we've started a new business, called 4R Digital, which is about business-to-business services. We can use software developers from all over the world, and that means we could couple up some, a small team of business analysts on the ground in East Africa with a developer, one who's sitting in Seattle, and 3 or 4 developers who are working out in Eastern Europe, and you can get a blended team together now. And again, it's just back to a different way of doing things. Geography is no longer a constraint. I think when it's on the technology side anyway, when it comes to putting teams together. The last year, if anything, with COVID has also reinforced that human ingenuity kicks in, doesn't it? And we all learn to live and to work with digital technology in a very different way. And I think that's been, of course, reinforced over the last 12 months. And I take my hat off to the team in M-Copa. I'm not on the ground there running things day to day. The CEO, Jesse Moore, has done a brilliant job in making sure that team has been able to cope with the restrictions from COVID in East Africa. So, over 800 people suddenly having to work overnight, almost having to work under a curfew situation and to work remotely. And the team barely missed a step. It was really done super efficiently. And I think that's, in many ways, that's, you take a step back and you think, well, actually, we can do this. We don't all need to be in an office looking at each other and if you can blend experienced developers with young upcoming engineers and allow them to work remotely, I think that's a really powerful thing. There are a couple of challenges for companies in that the big companies, so Microsoft opened, and this is Microsoft saying we believe in the investment in Africa. They've opened a big software development team and a new one of their 4 global centers in Nairobi. What often happens is the brightest and the most eager like to go and work for the big companies, as you'd expect early in their career, and that takes it away a little bit from the smaller companies trying to sort of compete for that resource. But I think in the round, it's a healthy thing. We've got young people are being trained in large corporates, and as long as we're starting to see more of them diffuse back in to work in the smaller companies and the startups. But I think it's a different story now compared to 10 years ago. It's really not an issue. There are some things to manage, but using technology, using remote teams, you can make it happen. And I think it's another tick in the box for me about what's exciting. This generation coming through are thinking about digital models from the outset, and not having to sort of go through the legacy systems in the way that my sort of generation had to.
And would you say there's a gender dimension to this? I'm curious because when you mentioned software engineers, one fear might be that this might kind of increase the gender gap in education.
Really good.
And I think here, both you and Leonard, I'd like to hear also the experience of the African School of Economics on that front. Do you see young women, catching up or even being ahead, as in part of the other continents, or there's a bit of a lag?
I'll answer first, but Leonard, I'm sure will have a much more detailed view on this from me. But no, I think there is in fact, it's not an African problem, is it? But I think there is definitely a gender gap, but there are lots of initiatives now, and African Development Bank a year ago launched a really big program to encourage female entrepreneurs. And I think that they quantified the funding gap for female entrepreneurs at $40 billion. And so they're doing their best to make their AFDB funds available for financial institutions lend out to train young female entrepreneurs. And I think it's that sort of initiative will close the gap. So I think it's a recognized issue, and you can see many organizations and some of the big foundations, really pushing hard to try and close that gap. And I think over the next 10 years, we'll see that come through.
Yeah. So to complement, there was a report today in University World News that ranked Benin 6th in the world in terms of women's engineers. So, I mean, like some of the Francophone countries have very strong STEM culture, like Senegal, Benin, Cameroon, and I think, and it has produced not only engineers but women in biomedical field, and fewer in economics. But so I think there is an opportunity if we invest, if we target, that we can actually reduce the gender gap in STEM in particular, and just in passing, for instance, like about 6 months ago, I set up the Pan-African Scientific Research Council, which is an association of African scientists. And among the group of computer scientists, applied math, and statistician, there is, I think, up to 40% women, in that group. So there is a potential there that could be strengthened and could be developed. And I think in that sector, Africa, at least some country in Africa can show the way, into how you reduce gender gap in STEM. Yeah.
Great. Yes, that's the message I want to hear. Now, we've gone too long without mentioning one of the topics, and one of our of the people in our audience has just asked a question. How about the political climate? So we can't stay away from that for too long. So, here I'd like Leonard to go first, because probably most of you know, but he's been on the front line when he was a little younger than he is now, really on the front line in Benin. And so I'd say you're best placed to start speaking about African politics. And you've done work on clientelism, ethnic divisions, and so on. Are all these things a myth nowadays, government instability, or is it something that is back in the back of our mind because of past history, and now we shouldn't worry about it, or there are still issues on that front, and if so, what can be done about it?
No, I think that's a great question. And in fact, clearly, it's more of a repression of the past than the current state of affairs in politics. Like when you talk about politics in Africa being clientelists, well, you forget about the fact that, in many countries, you have over 90% participation in election. People don't line up for hours to participate if they don't believe in democracy and freedom. And for instance, there have been protest movements across Africa recently, peaceful, driven by thirst of freedom. And by and large, Africa had been quite politically stable recently, at least much better today than it was like right in the 90s and late 80s, So now, and this is not very surprising, because there is, democracy and freedom is something which is deeply, deeply rooted in Africa. You look at Afrobarometer surveys, over 90%, or at least 70%, 75% in most countries, people value democracy, and they see democracy not just instrumentally, but intrinsically. They say, I want democracy because of freedom, because of the values democracy carries. So I think that's very, very important. Obviously, there are distortions, meaning corruption, mismanagement, misgovernance. And I think the way this can be corrected is to rethink how democracy should work in Africa. For me, one of the missing pieces is popular participation or public engagement in governance. Part of the African culture is deliberation, at village level, at community level. When there is an issue, people get together and debate, and then a consensus come out of that, and it's taken to the authorities to implement, and it's not something that had been integrated enough in the democratic institutions in Africa today. And I think decentralization coupled with stronger public participation, citizen engagement in governance is something that will really help improve outcome. Another important issue that maybe I'd like to raise is also improving state capacity. The big issue in Africa is not the lack of competition for office. It's not like lack of meaningful elections. It's the fact that the bureaucracies and the state agencies are incompetent. They are very slow, they are mismanaged. So there is an opportunity here as well to bring technology, for instance, to make things easier, pay taxes more easily, vote more easily, or, transfer money from the state to the school more easily, and check, have more digitized audit, for instance, to check what, So the same revolution that happened in the financial sector is something similar. It happened in governance, coupled with institutional reform that gets people to check more regularly how they are being governed. I think it's something that will go a long way, not only to improve, democracy in general, but also, the prospect for economic development.
Thank you. Now, Nick, do you share this view? What's your experience been? Have you encountered obstacles coming from the political environment, or more generally, would you say that bad quality of institutions is something that's holding investors back nowadays?
Yeah. Well, look, investment is all about you look at an opportunity and you weigh up the rewards and the risks, and political uncertainty, of course, is a risk, and if there's it complicates investment decisions, of course, but I don't think it's anything that's unusual. I don't think it necessarily anymore is holding investment back. What happens normally, from my own experience, either within a corporate or you're looking at investing as a VC, a venture capitalist, or an angel investor, you do your very best to sort of weigh up all the the pros and cons. And the thing that's most unnerving is uncertainty. So and that's hard both for investors, but it's also hard for managers. And and as a practitioner, the management team is constantly trying to plan ahead. So we have to take some assumptions into our budgeting and our planning processes. And where there's uncertainty, that makes things very difficult at a sort of operational level. And so things like tax is being changed almost overnight on, for example, in some of the territories we've worked in, overnight you'd suddenly get a new tax on solar energy, and that's, you can't deal with that in any other way other than having to pass prices on down to your consumers. And so those sorts of issues where there's a rapid change that businesses can't plan for, that's where it gets uncomfortable. But I think, just to Leonard's point, I think there's more that the international community can do in terms of FDI type investments, and the UK government actually, of course, especially post Brexit, we're trying. The UK government, I know, is trying very hard to look at how it can build stronger investment relationships with Africa, and I think there's probably a strong case to keep looking at that and saying, well, let's not just keep putting money into the small handful of countries in Africa where it's traditionally gone. Maybe we could take a wider view and look at different sectors, different countries from an FDI investment perspective. So I think there's more to do, but I don't think, being very frank, I just think politics is one of the risk factors that gets taken into account. If we can see more certainty and more stability, then I think it's only going to be good for ongoing investment.
Thank you. So from politics, I think, it's easy to transition to something closely related, which is culture. And all of these transformations, the fast growth and entry of investors, new sectors, also, transformations in health and changes in life expectancy and so on. Surely they have determined a very, significant change in culture among the young compared to the older generations. So there is, I think, these perceptions that at least in certain parts of Africa, there's being a very quick move towards a more consumerist type of culture and society that's becoming closer to the capitalist model. And is this true? What would be the implication for the continent, both on the economic front of what this might imply, but also for social cohesion? And this African culture has always been very distinctive. Are we going to lose that?
No, that's a great question. So I think that, first of all, I don't think there's no risk rate of losing what is really key or foundational in African culture. For instance, you still have a sense of, if you take education, for instance, you still have a sense that, the community educates, not just parents, and in some of my work, I show that this can be such a powerful engine for social mobility, because mobility not driven by what the parents does, but also what the neighbors and the community as a whole does, like the miracle, like for people like me, in a very poor, coming from a very poor, uneducated, parents in particular, who have done well, is driven not in part of who my parents were, but driven in part by this kind of sense of collective will to invest in every children's education, which is a very important part of African culture that still remains and will develop. I still send money to pay for all my cousins and nephews' education every month, so be done for me, I should do for others. So, and then I mentioned earlier, democratic culture, it's something that really underestimated. It's how profoundly attached Africans are to freedom in general and democracy, and I think you can see that, as I mentioned earlier, through the recent protests in, in Nigeria, across Africa, that the technology helped to manage better, to make it less violent in particular, So I think, and then, as Nick has mentioned, there is also an entrepreneurial culture, particularly driven by women in many communities. They are the ones who are involved in domestic trade in a very, very forceful way. They are the ones who are involved in open markets and in a very, very serious way. So, with some reform and some incentives, you can actually use this culture to boost the entrepreneurial kind of spirit that Nick has mentioned earlier, So, and also because of urbanization and others, there is more ethnic cooperation today than in the past. We tend to still talk about the 60s and the 70s, where you have, regional ethnic conflict. But today there are, more integration, ethnic integration across Africa than in the past. So, and the implication for this, it will be through education. Education where African culture is central to the teaching. Where members of a community, for instance, are part of communicating knowledge, to the kids, not only at primary school level, but middle school and high school level, more writing about African history, more museums, to show, young kids, young students today, what the past used to be and where we come from. This is very, very foundational, you know. And so I'm not concerned about African losing its culture. I'm concerned about not investing enough to preserve it, and to communicate it effectively to the current generations, you know, because this disconnect is what I'm concerned about, you know. Like, for instance, like in 1990, there was a national conference that led to the transition to democracy from Benin, from dictatorship to democracy. It's a model for the world. I mean, like, it was the first time a dictator was deposed through peaceful means after a national conference. The kids who were born after that barely know anything about it because there is no museum where you can see it, you can actually live it, you know. So I think it's important that my concern is the investment into preserving African culture, social and social and political. Yeah.
Thank you. How about you, Nick? I mean, what was your encounter with African culture, and you know, what's the single best part of it and the worst part of it for a business person? And the reason I'm asking is that the very same thing that Leonard praised, this sense of community, of, you know, being responsible for each other, is often also you know, highlighted as a limitation because, you know, people save less, they need to share instead of invest, and so on. What's your take?
Yeah, well, at a very micro level, I mean, we see it in the M-Copa business all the time. You know, you often sales guys and girls are out looking for leads, and they'll find a contact in a SACCO or what's like an informal savings group, and it's typically they're women led and managed. And what will happen in those sort of situations is one person will buy a product. And then others will observe and only make a decision when a leader or one person in that group has said, look, this is a good product. It's saving me money. It's solving other problems. And in fact, once you recognize that, you can actually build on it. And as a business, you need to follow that and realize that it's very important to impress the opinion leaders in a community to be successful. And that's certainly very clear. I mean, even silly things like when we first launched TVs. Now, the first time ever anyone could have a TV, and you might live miles from the grid. And these are low power TVs. You can buy them for about it was $1 a day at the time, or 100 shillings a day. And what we ended up doing, the most effective sales model, was we would host a TV party at a customer's house. And so, he would invite, or she would invite their neighbors around, and that's the way a sale would get made, because the community come together, I think, as Leonard was saying, and then there'd be a discussion, and then, they'd build off what one does and lead. And so I do think that's important. This we've talked about the entrepreneurial spirit a few times. That's really clear. And there's, if you think about the uptake of mobile money, it's not been paralleled anywhere else in the world. And there's a lot, we don't have time to go into reasons why things took off so quickly in Kenya, but cultural adoption and entrepreneurial spirit is definitely in the top 3 or 4 things that makes that something like that happen. And it can almost, there's a downside. We've seen hugely innovative business people using that digital platform, perhaps in ways that we didn't anticipate or even we want to happen. So gambling using mobile payments is a massive unintended consequence of putting a digital payment scheme in place. And to the point now where, you sense the regulators are going to come in and to stop it, because it's just too easy to make a bet, and so that's, maybe that sort of capitalist streak in the entrepreneurial drive has gone a bit too far in some cases, but harness it the right way and think carefully about how to use those strong communities, and I think it's a positive thing for business opportunities. Yeah.
Thank you. So let's do the following. I have a lot of really interesting questions in the Q&A, and then I had kind of a quick closing question for both of you. So I'm going to save my closing question as a cherry on the cake for last. And I'm going to start with a few of the questions that came up, okay? And one, because early on we spoke about M-Pesa, Safaricom, and Copa, and so on. A couple of people have actually highlighted something I think that's useful to go back to. That is, Safaricom has a 30% profit margin, 1/3 of which comes from M-Pesa. And there's a concern that these telecoms are really operating as a monopoly. So should we worry about lack of competition, which will increase costs for the customers, will also limit the entry of innovative companies? I'd like to hear you both on this point.
Shall I go first?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, first of all, make it clear, I'm no longer work for Vodafone or Vodacom, which owns Safaricom. And so what I'm saying is just my personal view. But I think when we launched M-Pesa, Safaricom had about a 60% market share, 60%. And there were I think there were four in total. So 3 other network operators competing. And of course, the government in Kenya owns a stake in Safaricom. So you have a sort of you don't quite have a fully, owned, privately owned company in Safaricom. You've got a part state-owned. But because of the success of M-Pesa, the market share went very quickly up because we'd discovered a product that really solved people's problems. And many customers moved onto a Safaricom SIM, an account, to be able to use M-Pesa. That at one point it was well above 90%. It's coming down now actually because there are other ways to move money around. The other network operators have moved here. The banks are doing their own thing, and so you start to see it normalizing a little bit. But I think it would send the wrong signal if you stifle success. You say, okay, you've been successful, you've grown a big market. Customers will very quickly vote with their feet if that product still doesn't serve their needs, or somebody comes along and offers a better system at a lower price. They will move. Customers will move. So I don't think it's quite as simple of, well, you're big. We want to bring you down to size so that it allows others in. Others have space to move. You don't want to stop investment in successful products. You've got to let the customer decide. And there are rules and mechanisms in the market to allow that to happen. And just over the last year, Safaricom, voluntarily stepped in and made things like transactions under 1,000 shillings, which is about $10, completely free, because of the situation that the country was facing with the COVID curfews and restrictions. And so, it's not like Safaricom is not watching its customer base and responding to the needs of the customers. Of course they are. They're just doing it very well, and being successful. It would be a shame to penalize that success because it's too big. I mean, it's probably a very big and a complex debate, but it isn't quite as simple as you're too big, therefore we've got to bring you down to size. For me, that as a business person, that's going to stop me finding the most successful routes to scale.
Leonard, what do you think about this?
So I'm going to move a little bit away from a specific sector to say more broadly that, like anywhere else, protecting competition and preventing, a monopoly power, it's really a key to technological innovation and to development. And I know that, in the study that I've done in Benin in particular, I find that corporations in Benin spend a lot of money on politicians, for instance, like very much in the US, to be able to maintain monopoly power. So, and, it calls for more transparency, better regulation, Because I mean, when we think of politics in Africa, we just know, oh yeah, those voters who don't know what they are doing, they just line up to vote, and we tend to forget about there is also a corporation that's very much involved in politics as well. So more broadly, I think it's important that we maintain and we protect competition, not to penalize any firm, not to penalize success, not to penalize like entrepreneurship, but at the same time to basically follow the creative destruction strategy, which has been one of the reasons why development happened, in Europe and North America in general. So I don't know exactly, for instance, how this market works, but I think they are clearly benefiting from innovation, from the entrepreneurial culture. But at the same time, at least in other part of Africa, I think it's important to make sure that the market structure remains competitive. Anyway, so that's my very general kind of points about this issue.
Yeah, and I think it's not trivial at all, because we're used to thinking that through regulation we deal with the problem, but precisely because this uncertainty around regulation, it has traditionally been one of the factors that was limiting investment in these countries. Governments are very wary about sending wrong signals, and I think there is a risk that in order not to scare away investors, we might not be handling the potential pockets of power concentration efficiently everywhere. And again, it might be very context dependent, but this is, in my view, one of the areas where policies really could benefit from closer scrutiny and possibly also data and evidence. Now, another thing that has come up in the questions here is, are we having a general discussion that applies to Africa, or are we talking about Kenya, Nigeria, or Ethiopia? I mean, how much is all of this, very encouraging picture evenly spread across Africa? Would you want to maybe mention a few of the uneven elements or regions where you see more concerns, or?
Shall I go first, Leonard? And actually, we've been doing a little bit of work recently in the Wheeler Institute at the London Business School to look at fintechs and scale. And that's been fascinating. Again, it's a big topic, and we're going to run out of time. But defining scale itself is actually quite hard. But do you mean scale in terms of customers, scale in terms of impact? Is it back to the same point? Is big good? Not necessarily all the time. So scale is quite hard. But when we look at we've looked at about 750 fintechs in Africa, and it's a thriving market, by the way. There's $1 billion went in 2019 into fintechs. So it's over 700 of these fintech companies. But actually, as we've got into the data and we're starting to slice out the ones that we believe have scaled, we're seeing most of those in Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa, and that that leaves many countries with no evidence yet of scaled fintechs, and that's sort of surprising to me. But then, on the face of it, but again, you sort of quickly fall into the trap of thinking Africa's one place, and it really isn't. I mean, there's, the regulatory question we were just talking about. It's so fragmented that makes it difficult for business models that require a regulatory sign-off to span multiple markets. It gets complex, and often in terms of license to operate, it's actually quite difficult to roll one product from country A to country B. And we learned that lesson very hard with M-Pesa in the early days. We took exactly the same platform from Kenya down to Tanzania, and we spent 2 years pulling our hair out. And in fact, under my watch, M-Pesa tried 3 or 4 times to launch in South Africa, and we simply couldn't do it partly because of the culture, partly to do with the regulations. So it's hard, So whilst I think we can be optimistic as we are on this, I think here we're all optimistic about the future, but that doesn't mean it's easy, right? And there are some places in Africa where it's really hard to do business. There's still a cash economy. The infrastructure isn't just limited; it's absent. And those are real hard nuts to crack. So yeah, I do think there's a need to start looking at how we can. For me, it is back to certainty. So some of the Pan-African trade deals that are starting to emerge, more common rules in things like, I'm always talking about mobile money, but now we know how to operate these schemes. Let's see some common standards set up across countries, and that will help. Because your question is a good one. There are still pockets of strong performance and pockets where it's absent or really hard to see scale of any sort happening soon. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So I think there are good news. The good news is that some of those success stories are regionally distributed. South Africa in Southern Africa, Kenya in Eastern Africa, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and Senegal to some degree in West Africa. So I think regional organizations have to see how around those hubs you can build the networks of, you can, for instance, a firm in Ghana, for instance, encourage, or in Nigeria, encourage those firms to reach out regionally. To have trade or arrangement between countries, for instance, that makes a firm in Nigeria very easy to set things up in Benin, or firms in Benin easy to set things up in Niger, and so on. I mean, especially given that because of historical legacies, those regional hubs already exist. Like for instance, in the 50s and 40s, all the Francophone Africa and West Africa were basically one country. And I think the African Continental Free Trade Zone is a good start, but I think, as Nick has mentioned, there might be a need to be more aggressive in terms of facilitating, basically establishment of foreign, like firms in a given country. If I want to take the case of African School of Economics, it's a good place, but then the market is very small. It's just, if it's just Benin, it will not use the potential coming from other countries. So as a result, we have been able to set up a campus in Cote d'Ivoire. We're also trying to set up a partnership with Stellenbosch University and a partnership with Mohammed VI in Morocco, so that we can actually benefit from, in some places where it's going to be expensive to establish a presence, we join forces with local institutions so that we can offer the service, and access to the market. And a place where we can, basically establish a presence, we do it, So, and it was easy in Cote d'Ivoire because they are both Francophone countries and they are traditionally part of the same bloc, So I think the unevenness is something that can be overcome, if we have a strategy that use regional, regional companies or companies that are entrenched in, like East Africa, facilitate an expansion around that place, like M-Pesa in Tanzania, in Malawi, in other places. So that would be, I think, a good start to be able to reduce the gap that you just mentioned between countries, which is very unfortunate.
Thank you. So one of the questions here that came up is about the extent to which minerals or resources are going to be a driving force or not, and how the presence of China and the politics around you might interact with everything we've been saying. We haven't spoken about that. Do you see that as something that nowadays you cannot leave out of the discussion if you talk about Africa's growth, China and its policy in terms of African resources?
So, Nick, you want to start?
No, after you, Leonard. You go first. I'll.
Okay. No. That's a hard question. So, no, I think, okay. I have concern because I think growth in Africa has benefited from sometimes holding government accountable and the push for democracy and accountability. And, China doesn't have any democratic or governance precondition for investment, which might drive up corruption, obviously. And so that's not a good thing. So, but then at the same time, China has focused on infrastructure investment and energy investment in infrastructure and energy, which is a big positive, because I think the drag to African development has been not only the fact that the road networks and infrastructure are not up to where they need to be, not only in quality, but also even the network aspect. Like for instance, most of the roads that were set up are colonial roads that do not help integrate market east-west or north-south, because it was road that were set up from cities to mines or from city to cash crop areas, So, and I think the fact that China made a lot of its investments in infrastructure is positive. But I'm also concerned about, for instance, issues of when people have talked about land grab, how some, not just China, but in other countries, people can basically very cheaply get very fertile land because it's going to disrupt agricultural development, and so I think there should be a need for regional strategy, not just each country to think about what the approach to China should be. I think AU and other regional organizations, for instance, should work at having a coordinated effort to deal with, for instance, Chinese investments or even the political economy of Chinese investment as well. Now regarding the mining, I think, as I mentioned earlier, growth has been driven in part by mine, but also by service, and, in Nick's work and what he talked about, the development of financial services, for instance, the banking sector booming in many countries. This is what drives growth. So it's the case that Africa is not, okay, even if in terms of export, many countries are still depending on mines, it's still the case that my sense is that countries are becoming less and less dependent on natural resource, when you talk about Nigeria today, yeah, talk about oil, but you also talk about the fintech and also the boom in the tech sector in Lagos, And Ghana, for instance, has tried to find a way to manage oil or, natural resource discovery quite well, make it, so I think I'm less concerned today about, the political economy of, natural resource dependence than I should have been in the 80s and 90s, and anyway, and also the government, for instance, in general, increasingly democratic, and which is very counterintuitive because we know that places where you have natural resource, you tend to have dictatorships, So my relationship between power and natural resources, it's something that is not what it used to be, which is a good sign. And again, talking about China, I'm worried about the political influence that they may have on bringing back up, not helping promote democracy. But I'm also extremely positive about the fact that the focus of the investment is on infrastructure, because this is where Africa has the most needs. Yeah.
Yeah, Leonard, I totally agree with a lot of your points, and yeah, it's a sensitive topic, isn't it? But I once heard a very respected Kenyan political leader say, when somebody asked him in an audience, actually said, aren't you worried about China? And he said, well, look, the real world is China are here and investing. The door is open. And he was deferring that he was answering a question from a UK government delegation, and he said, look, the door's open. If the UK wants to come in and to start helping work with us on infrastructure or big investment projects, nobody's stopping that happening. It's the door is open. But he was very clear. It's not, we can't criticize China, for being there, being present, and getting involved. And we're standing on the sidelines looking at our 5-year business plans and saying, oh, I can't quite work my return on investment. I'm not going to be able to make this business decision. That China doesn't play by those rules. China will say, we want to move in, we want to go in and to get involved in long-term projects. They're taking a longer game view than our 5-year ROI calculations tend to manage to take into account. So I think, and again, just on the technology side, there's some really interesting developments. If we look to Asia now for the way the fintech market is evolving, I think there's some really good stuff and some bad stuff, but things like the use of digital identities, which can help greatly with government welfare programs. They can sort of ease the way into financial services for people who are still excluded, and that is still the case for the majority of people across Africa. So thinking about digital identity, thinking about moving more government services onto digital platforms, these are all positive things. So I think we should look for the positives in this and realize that there's different ways of doing business, but there are many good examples of technology application that we can learn from China. The downside, of course, you then worry privacy, data security. It's always a trade-off, but back again to looking at the wider picture and starting to make decisions about what we think can work. I think there's lots to do there. And I think on the natural resources point, there's of course that's a particular sector, and there's it has a path ahead of it where Africa is sitting on vast reserves of natural minerals and resources, and that should be used to Africa's advantage. But there's other sectors too. I mean, I saw a staggering data point the other day. Africa has 11 terawatts of solar energy. I mean, that's more energy than we can know what to do with. We simply can't manage 11 terawatts of energy, anywhere. So how do you harness it, and how do you bring it to the point of need? That's a fantastic opportunity when you think of the forward energy sector in Africa. Africa also has about 60% of the world's available arable land, and yet there are inefficiencies in that sector. We should be thinking about, diversifying away from just minerals and resources and more towards improvements in other sectors, and energy and agriculture are two big ones where there's lots of upside, and lots of room to drive efficiencies into those other sectors. And for me, that's all in the optimistic side of the coin.
Thank you, Nick. So there's one last question before we wrap up that I want to read from the audience, which brings us back to this importance of higher education. And the idea here is, if we want to attract highly educated people or retain highly educated people, what initiatives do you know about that governments or businesses have taken because brain drain is an issue for sure, and I'm sure you, Leonard, have thought about it a lot, but maybe Nick as well. In the business sector, what can be done to make sure that the talent stays in Africa and works for Africa?
I mean, I think the issue of brain drain is a bit over exaggerated, because, like I have a lot of people like me, you don't know whether we are in Africa or here, because we have set up companies, we have done things across Africa, and we are part of the African voice, at the highest level, which is needed, like for instance, I mean, when you invited me to be part of this panel, you didn't look at my zip code, you didn't care whether I'm based in New York or anywhere, I'm African, so I think we should be very careful about integrating African talent in Africa, outside Africa, as opposed to, talking about, and then, one initiative, for instance, there are many, like for instance, the Association of African Universities have a program, to bring African from diaspora back to teach. I don't know how effective it is. I think what we need is that some of the best universities in Africa has to be very aggressive on the job market to bring some African back, like Cape Town, Stellenbosch, Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire. I mean, recently, Mohammed VI, which is, Polytechnic Mohammed VI, have been recruiting Africans from everywhere, to teach in their programs, So I think those initiatives on top of, what I'm personally doing, the African Council of Economics, I think are examples of how you can push things. But the bottom line here is that, I mean, I come back to what Nick have said, about, for instance, solar energy and so on. So given that if this area can be potentially a comparative advantage for Africans, for African countries, for instance, why not be able to set up really cutting edge lab and research centers that highly connected with labs around the world, where the best ideas, the most innovative ideas in how to use this technology creatively will come from there, You see what I mean? Not have people scattered around the world who work on those issues in an isolated place in Northern Canada, I mean, so what I'm saying is that there is a potential for government, for international organization, for corporation, for instance, to sort of invest not only in the production of, but also the fundamental research by training, by bringing some of the best back or connected them to what's happening in Africa. And that's how we can very push the higher education up. I mean, like, I'm pretty sure that one day when we hear that there are a couple of Africans from Cameroon who won the Nobel Prize in physics, you'll have a generations of Africans wanting to become physicists. So we have to go for basic.
Maybe it's your job to inspire them on that.
We have to be basic. We also have to be at the frontier, and this is we have to be playing at the, anyway. So that's what I think. Yeah, sorry.
Nick, your 2 cents, because then I have my closing question.
Yeah, sure. Well, I don't know if you're followers of the fourth industrial revolution, which many sort of market watchers think we're going through, which is all about digital and AI and machine learning. I think Africa has this massive opportunity because it's not dealing with the legacy infrastructure problems that we are in here in Europe. So to build on Leonard's point, that generation of business leaders coming through can be thinking and operating in a world where they are working on these new fourth industrial revolution concepts, and that's coming. It's actually here. I mean, I don't think we're all fully aware of it yet, but we are moving into a completely different paradigm. It's all digital, and all the legacy stuff that we've seen for generations and we still live with in Europe. You don't need to have that in these new economies. And so I back again to being more of an optimist. To build on Leonard's point, the tertiary education should be all over that in Africa, building for a digital future, and they're going to get there quicker than other countries that are sort of hamstrung by systems we built that are 100 years old, whether it's water, power, or banking. You don't need to do things the way that things have evolved slowly in the Western world. So.
Yeah, that's a very important point, actually. So I have one question I really wanted to ask both of you, and then I'd like, Nicola and Elias maybe to close this meeting. But my one question, because I knew that this was going to be a panel with two visionaries, was and is, if you were to isolate the one thing that makes you most hopeful about the future of Africa, what would that be?
Young. It's a young population, young, optimistic, and resilient, because, for instance, it's not for those of us, who live in Africa for a long time, you are not surprised about, for instance, how, Africa dealt with COVID-19, so there is some degree of social cohesion, there is some degree of expertise that's out there, and also the fact that the continent is very, very, very young and will remain young for a long, long time, which I think it's very, very positive. But to finish, I know one of the things that already exists is a stronger sense of agency. Governments and organizations in Africa are making their own decision. For instance, monetary the reform in West Africa on to create a regional currency that's not directly tied to euro, and also the trade zone that we talked about. So, and I think there is, and also the fact that the young people and embracing new technology with so much passion and determination, with the result that we are seeing through, for instance, what Nick has been discussing. So I'm optimistic because of the youth, because of the enthusiasm and resilience, of Africans in general. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think you hit the nail on the head, Leonard. It's it's a young population, it's eager for growth, and you have this fantastic digital sort of opportunity ahead. I think that's hugely exciting, and I can't get away from that number. By 2050, 1 in 4 people on this planet will be African. If we're not thinking about that as businessmen or investors, then we're not doing our job properly, because it's clear. I mean, just the demographics alone point towards this huge opportunity. And then, it's not, of course it's not easy, and it's hard, and it's going to need graft, but I think, Leonard's got it right. This is a young generation coming through. They don't have legacy infrastructure problems. Of course, that's a depending on your lens you put on, that's either a problem. That lack of infrastructure is either a problem or it's an opportunity. But if you're in the opportunity camp, I think there's lots of exciting stuff to be done over the next couple of decades in Africa. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So it's been a real pleasure to hear your thoughts on all these things. Nicola, to you, the closing of this very nice conversation. Thank you.
Well, I want to be very brief. This event was organized also, as you said, Eliana, earlier at the very beginning, to give an optimistic perspective on Africa. I think what we learned also in these closing remarks is the idea that, sources of optimism are like markets which are made of the people, growing in number, but also in education, aspiration that Leonard was talking about and the entrepreneurs, but also combined with the technologies that Nick was talking about. And, you know, in the developed world now, we are kind of very skeptical, both of markets and of technology, and we think they lead to inequality, to many problems, etc., which of course they do, but I thought it was very refreshing here to hear that the combination of these two powerful factors can, you know, satisfy the need of many people in the poorest continent in the world. And so on this note, optimistic, I would like to thank you, Eliana, for moderating with great skill this event, and to our two visionaries, Leonard and Nick. And I would also like to thank Elias for co-organizing this event.
No, I just want to say on behalf of LBS and Wheeler that it was fantastic collaborating with Bocconi. It's great to see Nicola and Eliana, and it's so fantastic to learn from Nick and Leonard. Every time I meet you, I learn something, and I think that we had a very big group of close to 400 people attending, which was a fantastic event. Thank you all very much for being here. You can see some of the forthcoming events that EGR and LBS Wheeler are organizing. We hope to see you soon.